Welcome to our program today. Our topic today is going to be vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is the largest of all the vitamins, absolutely essential for life. And vitamin B12 is not made in the human body, and so we must obtain it from other sources in our diet. And today we're going to look at some of the fascinating biology, chemistry, and science and medicine around vitamin B12 metabolism. And it's my prayer that as we look at all of this information, as we look at the light that God has shed upon this topic, that we will be enlightened and wise with the wisdom that He would give us, that we may make the best use of our bodies, our lives, as we go forward to the issues of the last days. So we'll begin here. And I'm going to begin. I want our objective to be really clear. And so I'm going to move ahead here. And we're going to start off, and I'm going to put up here, well, there we go. I'm going to start with the very last slide in the lecture. So this is our final concluding slide of the lecture. I want the objective to be clear. If you're someone who takes notes, here's the notes you want to take for the lecture right here. We're going to conclude with the recommendation of taking vitamin B12 supplements in the form of methylcobalamin. It comes in different forms. This large molecule has different groups attached to it we'll talk about. But of all the different forms out there, methylcobalamin is the best form, and that's pretty generally recognized, and most supplements you see on the market shelf today will be methylcobalamin now. And so you won't have a hard time finding that. 5,000 micrograms is a common dose. 5,000 micrograms is the same as 5 milligrams, but they all seem to want to put it in micrograms. And so this is the way you'll see it out there. It comes in quick dissolve tablets that dissolve in your mouth or that you chew up in your mouth. This is very important, and we'll talk about why that is. These are much better than ones that come in a capsule mixed up with other things that you swallow and don't dissolve till they get to your stomach. It's highly recommended if you're on a plant-based diet. You know, in all of our lectures and health presentations, we've talked about the benefits of a plant-based diet, but one of the disadvantages of a plant-based diet is that it is not a good source of vitamin B12. And so we're going to be recommending the supplementation of vitamin B12. This particular package here comes from Costco. For about $20 here, you get enough to last 2 or 3 people for an entire year. So it's very inexpensive, readily available from many distributors. So let's take a closer look here at this molecule. This large molecule. Most vitamins are small little molecules that fit in various places. They're cofactors or nutrients or used as building blocks. But this particular one is a gigantic molecule. There is a flat planar ring right here with a cobalt molecule right in the very center of that. Cobalt has 6 bonding positions on it. 4 of them around the periphery joined with nitrogen here, part of this large, flat, ring-like surface. And then this has a little tail. The tail is attached around here. And here, the tail attaches right on the bottom of this. So you've got the 4 coming in from the sides. The tail reaches around and holds the 5th one. And that leaves the last one sticking up here. This is going to be the active site. This is where we will attach and disattach other molecules that can be held and yet are held loosely enough that we can take them off and use them in various processes in the body. The empty form has just a hydroxyl there, But the methylcobalamin, which we take, has a methyl group right here. But the body can also put adenosine and other molecules here if needed to use them in this tool, and they can interchange them. Vitamin B12 is absolutely essential to every single cell in your body. There is no cell in your body that can carry on its life functions without a good supply of vitamin B12. No matter what cell it is, what it's doing, that cell is going to need vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is something we call a cofactor. Now, in your body, there are a lot of different functional proteins. We often refer to these as enzymes. They are large protein molecules that do various chemical reactions, chemical functions at very high speeds and build whatever it is your body needs, carry on whatever energy reaction, whatever needs to be done to carry on the life function is done by these proteins. Vitamin B12 is a cofactor. It is used. Here you'll see a representation of a large enzyme, a protein molecule that has a certain job to do. And right here is an active site where it holds onto and takes a vitamin B12 molecule. If you think of it like a mechanic, this is a mechanic, but he needs a certain tool to do the particular job that he's assigned on the assembly line that he's on. And in many cases with vitamin B12, that is adding a methyl group to some other molecule that's being built in this assembly line. And so to do it, he needs a vitamin B12, the methylcobalamin that's got a methyl group right here. He will grab that here, and then he will use that to stick a methyl group onto another molecule that's being built or used there. And then he will drop the tool, pick up another one, and use it for the next molecule as they keep going by the assembly line. And you can do this very rapidly in nanosecond speed. The B12 that's dropped off here now can actually be recycled, and we can stick another methyl group on it and use it again. But we need an ongoing supply of these for many different functions in the body. That's the tool the mechanic uses, and it has to keep being loaded up with the methyls and use it to stick them onto the various molecules that are being built or changed or modified in various ways there. One of the very important places where it is used is DNA synthesis and regulation. The code of life, the code that has the pattern for building everything. We need to replicate this, and every time a cell divides, and we need a large amount of vitamin B12 to do this. Red blood cells. During the time of this lecture right now, we will build in your body millions of red blood cells. Every one of those in its division must uncoil the DNA, make a duplicate copy of it, coil it back up, divide it into two, and then we get a cell division. And we're doing this millions of times over the next hour just to make the red blood cells that you need to make in the next hour. And all cell growth in your body, whether you're dividing liver cells or microglial cells or whatever cells it is, we need to have the vitamin B12 to manage the DNA division there in those cells. So absolutely essential there. Here's a picture here you can see of the red blood cells. These are normal, healthy red blood cells here, the little biconcave shape. There's lots of them in there filling your blood. We need the B12 to make that. This picture is a picture of the something called megaloblastic anemia. It's part of pernicious anemia. This is a vitamin B12 deficiency. And you'll notice instead of all being the same little perfect shapes, there are some enlarged ones that are not the right shape. And overall, there is much fewer being made. It's an anemia. There's not nearly enough around. And because of their shape differences and stuff, they're not carrying oxygen properly. And so we have this condition right here, one of the early signs that the body does not have enough B12. We're becoming anemic, and this megaloblastic anemia is the finding there that gives us a clue that something is wrong. In the nervous system, the neurons which send through the electrical impulses, sensations come in, motor things come out. Through these neurons, we carry on the various electrical circuits for thought. Everything we think, our emotions, our feelings, our logic, planning. The delicate nerves of the mind are the only channel through which God communicates with man. We need these working properly. And so as they travel along here, they have this special coating here. It's called a myelin sheath. There are special cells in the brain, oligodendrocytes. They reach out and they actually wrap this membrane. You can see it right here. This is a neuron going through the center right here, like we took a cross section right here. So if we take a cross section there, we've got these layers of membrane just wrapped around there. And because of this insulating, protecting, supporting on this right here, the electrical impulse, instead of traveling at the normal speed like it would down one of these little short branches here, it travels at high speed, jumping from node to node. And because of the high-speed transmission made possible by the myelin sheath, ordinary thought is possible. If we start to lose the myelin sheath, slow down these neurons, we start losing memory, confusion, and as the circuits can't travel at the right speed, eventually dementia settles in and eventually death. We must have well-myelinated neurons for clear, accurate thought. And so vitamin B12 is absolutely essential in the forming of this myelin sheath around here. So we'll find one of the signs of vitamin B12 deficiency are various degrees of neurodegeneration, emotional and functional and cognitive decline become part of that. And unfortunately, it seems the cognitive degeneration associated with a B12 deficiency is a permanent damage. It's not an easily reversible one. It's one we want to prevent rather than try to treat after we have created the problem. Vitamin B12 is essential for production of energy in your body. The mitochondria, these little organelles, they've got these little divisions right here. Inside of here, your fuel, whether it's glucose or fatty acids or whatever we're going to be burning for fuel at the moment, goes into here. It's broken down in these complex enzyme pathways here to extract all of the energy out of it. We need vitamin B12 inside of there to help get the energy out of the food that we've eating and we're using. So where do we get vitamin B12? It's necessary for all animal life, and yet not a single animal on our planet is created with the enzymes to build a vitamin B12 molecule. And as we look around, all of the greenery, all of the vegetable life, whether it's the grass, the trees, the other plants, none of the plant sources have the enzyme pathways to build vitamin B12. And so where do we get the vitamin B12 if, how many of the animals are on a vegetarian diet, like God recommends for us as well, and there's no vitamin B12 in the greenery? Where do they get all of their vitamin B12? There's only one place that you can get vitamin B12, and that's in microbes, bacteria. God created these bacteria with the enzyme pathways, and most all bacteria have the enzyme pathways to build vitamin B12. And so the source of vitamin B12 for all animal life comes from the various bacteria in the environment here. So how do we get the bacteria, the vitamin B12, from the bacteria into the human body? Imagine some deer that are living here. Where are they going to get their vitamin B12? Well, if we look at this meadow right here, if you went out and examined the top 5 inches of soil in that meadow, you would find that that was just full of bacteria, just teeming with life, full of vitamin B12 there. And it's on the plants and stuff as they eat it there. As the deer, as they graze upon the meadow, they're eating that right there. As they eat it and process it, their fecal droppings fall on the meadow. And of course, this fecal material is just full of more fresh microbial life, full of vitamin B12. As the rain comes, as the water runs across this meadow here, it runs into the streams. The streams are full of the bacteria and the vitamin B12. And so the deer and the other creatures, as they drink from the stream, again, are getting all of the vitamin B12 that they need. And so in nature, this doesn't seem to be a problem. Well, can we get our vitamin B12 this way? We probably could in a perfect world. The world's not so perfect now. There's a lot of bad bacteria and viruses and parasites and things to be really harmful to the human body that are going to be found in contaminated water sources. So while it would be a good source of B12, contaminated water is not really a good place to obtain our vitamin B12 today. So where else? What about the non-vegetarian animals? Where do they get their B12? Well, the lion, he can eat the deer that drank the contaminated water and ate from the things, and the meat is full of vitamin B12, especially the liver. The liver stores vitamin B12, and as the lion eats the deer, he gets the B12 he needs. Can we do that? Yeah, we can go ahead and eat the deer as well, and many of the other creatures. All meat sources are large, good sources of vitamin B12, and throughout the last few millennium here on planet Earth, the human race has got its vitamin B12 primarily from the animal sources here. In the last days of this Earth's history, though, we're really seeing the tremendous amount of disease in animals and the unhealthy aspects of an animal-based diet, and look to the benefits of a plant-based diet. And plant-based diet, particularly if you wash your food, and I recommend washing your food. Food that's not washed may be contaminated with E. coli that are toxic, with salmonella. There's other parasites and eggs, worms, and things that can be on contaminated food. And you really don't want to bring all of these disease sources into your body. So what's our option? Well, that brings us right back to where we said we were going to end this lecture. And this isn't the end. We've got a lot more fascinating stuff to share. But we come down to today there are readily available, simple, supplementary sources to add vitamin B12 to our diet. We talked about the complexity of this. This large molecule, because of its large size and complexity, is vulnerable to destruction in the human body. And so God has designed a rather complex mechanism to protect vitamin B12 and to get it into the human body. And it starts right in the mouth here. When you take and dissolve your vitamin B12 tablet in your mouth right here and mix it with saliva, in that saliva, there is this special protein. Here's a diagrammatic shape of this, transcobalamin. It's actually a cobalamin transporter. Its job is to transport vitamin B12. And if you look at it, there's sort of two halves to it here that are connected. It's like hinged, like a little clamshell. And the vitamin B12 goes right in the center, and when it clicks into place, the clamshell snaps shut, and you've got this protective shell around the vitamin B12, so that when you swallow this complex now, and it goes down into the stomach, into this tank of concentrated hydrochloric acid, proteolytic enzymes, that vitamin B12 is totally safe and protected inside that little clamshell there. Isn't that neat? When we get to the stomach, there's a whole nother process going on here. There is another little protein here, another clamshell-shaped protein called intrinsic factor that is made in the stomach. If you look at the stomach lining right here, we can take a close-up of this one piece right here. You see your stomach is lined with these little glands, or little tubular glands lined with secreting cells. These are the cells that make and secrete the concentrated hydrochloric acid into the stomach. They secrete the proteolytic enzymes into the stomach. And they also make and secrete intrinsic factor into the stomach. So say you had just eaten the flesh of a deer, full of vitamin B12. When the meat hits the stomach right here, all of those acids and enzymes just start tearing and ripping it apart. And in the process, they're releasing all the B12 in those cells. And now this intrinsic factor immediately, clamshell, starts snapping it up before it can be damaged and has it protected. So now we've got the vitamin B12 that came out in the stomach protected here. We've got the ones that were free in the mouth protected. And now it moves on to the stomach, from the stomach to the next part of the intestine here. And at this point, the pancreas is dumping out powerful alkaline solutions here to neutralize all the acid. This job is done. These enzymes are degraded and destroyed, and the acid is gotten rid of, and a whole new set of digestive enzymes is released here from the pancreas into the small intestines. And at this point, the ones that came in the mouth, the little clamshell, the transcobalamin, it gets dissolved away. The little clamshell dissolves away, releasing its B12, and extra intrinsic factor, which was in the stomach and didn't pick up something here, is down here now, and it will snap that up. So at this point now, all of the B12, the ones in the mouth that was protected through the stomach, or the ones that were protected by intrinsic factor here, now they're all picked up, they're all snapped up inside of the intrinsic factor right here, nice and safe right there. The intrinsic factor is really important not only to continue to protect it, but the intrinsic factor has special connectors that are going to attach to receptors and allow us to absorb. This is a large molecule. It can't just pass through a cell wall like many smaller molecules. It needs a special receptor mechanism to take it into the cell right here. And so we have it now all bound up here. It's moving on down through the small intestines. And when we get to the very last part of the small intestine here, the terminal ileum, just before we go into the colon, This is where we absorb our vitamin B12. It's the only place in the body where we can actually take it from the gut and take it into the body and get it into the bloodstream so it can go to the rest of the body there. Here is a picture of the lining of our last part of our ileum there, where we're going to absorb the B12. And you'll notice these columnar cells. There's a cell, there's a cell, there's a cell. They're all stacked up like this. On the side facing the gut here, where our digested food is passing by, where we want to absorb, there's all this increased surface area. At the base of all of these little microvilli here, there is a little receptors here. These little receptors are made with things just to catch intrinsic factor, with, of course, its vitamin B12 inside. Here is a picture. They kind of switch colors on us here. This green molecule in this picture is the intrinsic factor with the B12. It shows it snaps in and matches perfectly with this special receptor protein here that's made just to catch the intrinsic factor. And once it catches the intrinsic factor, then this whole complex is taken into the cell, again with the vitamin B12 carefully stored inside of it. So here we see the gut wall here, the lining of mucosa here, the intrinsic factor out there. This is inside the body. This would be like the bloodstream here, where we're going to transport it to the rest of the body. Here we will, we've kind of enlarged one of the cells here, so we can see one of these cells with a little villi out here. And now here, they've put in blue right here. This is like the little receptors for the intrinsic factor. Here they've got the intrinsic factor with its vitamin B12 in the center. It comes down, snaps into place right here. Once it captures that, it is just swallowed up, taken inside, makes this like a little vacuole of membrane around it, and now we've got this little sac in here, and inside there we've got these are cut off and separated, and they can actually be recycled back out to the surface so they can capture another one. The intrinsic factor with the vitamin B12 in it, this becomes a lysosome, comes in there, and it starts digesting, and it breaks up the intrinsic factor now. It's digested away, and the various amino acids will be recycled. The vitamin B12 is now inside the cell, and it's released free inside the cell. Of course, it can use it for its own purposes, because it needs some vitamin B12. But as a gut cell, its job is to absorb it and pass it on to the rest of the body. And so much of it will be taken out here, and when there's special cells or receptor proteins here that will actually excrete it out into your bloodstream. And you actually make new transporter molecules. They're transcombine. They're similar to the ones in the mouth, the little clamshells that pull it up. They will come out, are secreted as well. They will snap it up again inside the little clamshell, and in this form, it is carried through the bloodstream. Here we show another cell in the body, has little receptors out here for it, and it can take this transporter protein with its B12, pull it into the body. Again, this little receptor can be recycled and used again, will digest away the transporter protein, and we've got free vitamin B12 inside of here. If this is a liver, we can store up to 5 years worth of vitamin B12 in the liver. Very important fact for the times when we may not be able to get it. So if we have been building up and have a regular good supply, if for some reason you should not be able to get the supply, remember you do have reserves. It's not a minute-by-minute supply. It really, you can store up to 5 years worth of vitamin B12 in your liver for use of the body. And remember, the body tends to recycle and use it as well. Dr. Castle got the Nobel Prize back in 1934 for discovering intrinsic factor. And he's the one that discovered that, and the first of our knowledge about this complex pathway right here. You will find that he had a rather unique method. This is before much of our modern science techniques back in 1934. And he had these patients with pernicious anemia, this vitamin B12 deficiency. And he would feed them liver, which was full of vitamin B12, and it didn't help because they didn't have intrinsic factor. But of course, nobody even knew there was an intrinsic factor. And he took, every morning, he would get up and take about 300 grams of beef, raw beef, and eat it. He would wait an hour for it to start digesting really good, and then he would force himself to regurgitate up this beef and the, this partially digested beef and all the stomach juices with it. He then would strain it out and get just the liquid out of there, and then he would give this liquid to the patients with pernicious anemia to drink, along with giving them their meal of liver that had B12 in it. And guess what? He was able to cure the pernicious anemia in all of them with this method which he created, showing that the stomach was making something that we needed to absorb the vitamin B12. And apparently these patients were defective in doing that. So here is one of the forms of vitamin B12 in the body. And this particular one, instead of putting a methyl group there, it has an adenosine molecule here. And again, it's used in one of the functions right here. We're going to take just a few minutes to look briefly at some of the things, the problems that go wrong when we don't have B12, some of the important pathways it's needed for, and what goes wrong when we don't have the B12 for these pathways. Something called MMA, methylmalonyl-CoA. This particular molecule is a very toxic byproduct that's left over when you burn fat. Fat comes in these long fatty acid molecules, and when you burn fat, maybe you're fasting, exercising a lot, and you're burning off, and you're burning up these fatty molecules, it chops up these long hydrocarbon tails, but when it gets down the head, there's a piece left over here, and we end up with this. This is toxic, and we really have to get rid of it. But we don't have a normal way to get rid of it, or I should say we do. It's a way that uses vitamin B12. Here you can see this particular enzyme whose job is to take the MMA and convert it into succinyl-CoA. It has to have this B12, the adenosyl version of B12 to do it. And with the B12 there, it can take the MMA, turn it into succinyl-CoA. Now, in your mitochondria, you may remember studying the Krebs cycle, sometimes called the citric acid cycle. This is where we take glucose, start breaking it down in pieces, and we go through this circle like here, and we just keep pouring more in, and it runs through the cycle. In the process, it's all burned up, and we end up with water, carbon dioxide, and lots of energy. Well, notice one of the steps here is the succinyl-CoA. So the succinyl-CoA we just made from the MMA goes right into here and is burned up. So now we totally get rid of the toxic MMA from the body and burn it up in the mitochondria here. But again, one of the important needs for vitamin B12 in the body, if you don't have the B12, this will build up. We can actually do a blood test and show if that level is increasing, we can presume that you may be deficient in vitamin B12. Homocysteine is another toxic amino acid that can build up in the body. Doctors will sometimes measure your homocysteine level. Homocysteine can be toxic to the endothelium. That's the lining of your blood vessels, and it starts damaging that. We start breaking that down. That is one of the risk factors to arteriosclerosis, developing the plaques in the artery walls, and progressing to heart attacks and strokes, the #1 cause of death and disability in this country. Homocysteine is one of the bad players in that process. Where does the homocysteine come? Methionine is an important amino acid. You'll notice the sulfur groups here on both of them. This one has a methyl group attached to the sulfur group. And your body actually uses methionine with the methyl group there to add methyl to many important processes that we need. And so we'll take the methionine, use it to methylate something. Well, when you use it to methylate something, that takes the methyl off of it, and we end up with homocysteine. So in your little diagram here, you'll see the methionine, it methylates something, and it ends up as homocysteine. The good news is we can take the homocysteine, stick a methyl group back on it, and make it back into methionine. And how do we do that? Vitamin B12, methylcobalamin. It's got a methyl group up in the right spot. And these particular enzymes here can actually take the vitamin B12 that's been methylated, transfer the methyl over here to the homocysteine, make it back into methionine, keep this homocysteine down to a level where it's not toxic, and supply plenty of methionine to continue on the various things that need to be methylated in the body. If your homocysteine level is elevated, that could well be a sign that you are not having enough vitamin B12 in your body. DNA, we mentioned how important DNA is for life. You know how much DNA is in your body? If you took every cell and peeled the DNA out of it and stretched it out end to end, and did that for every cell in your body, it would reach all the way from planet Earth, 93 million miles to the sun, and back again, and back again, and back again. 3.5 times we would make that trip just with the DNA. This thin thread, bound together strongly so it doesn't break, is how much DNA is all coiled up carefully inside of your cells. But of course, the real challenge is how do you get that much thread stuffed in that small of a place without making a tangled mess that you can't untangle? Well, God knew what he was doing. And so he designed this DNA right here with special little spools. And each little spool gets it wrapped around. And each of these little spools now has coiled up a piece of it. Then he takes these little spools and coils them up into a coil. And then he takes this coil and makes it into these super coils here. And these super coils, he winds up and actually to make these here. So we can take a huge amount of this DNA thread, each little inch of it coding for certain amino acids and things here, all of that, and put it up in a form. In this form, we can now divide the cell and send half of it with each new cell there. Every time we divide 2 cells to make new cells, we've got to uncoil. Every inch of this has got to be uncoiled, and you have to make a duplicate copy of it, and then each of the duplicate copies has to be individually coiled up. So these little coiling process is absolutely essential for carrying on the function of life. Here is a closer look at some of those little coils here. There's little spools that wind it up. Here you can see one of them right here. It's actually several pieces that come together. Here you can see a little coil of the DNA just written as this little tube around it right here. And you'll notice each of these little subunits that makes up this spool has little tails coming out of it. Little amino acid tails. These are all protein structures. And these little amino acid tails have places where you can stick on other groups. And you can methylate some of the certain sites on there. And as you methylate certain sites, these little tails are like switches. And so it turns on the coiling mechanism and causes it to coil up its piece of DNA. You can take the methyl groups off and put acetyl groups on it, and it actually makes it uncoil the DNA and take the DNA off of it. So this is how you just make it coil and uncoil. Well, if all the coiling and uncoiling that's going on to duplicate every time you divide a cell, you see how much vitamin B12? Because we need vitamin B12 for all of this methylation here is vitamin B12 dependent. So to coil up your DNA every time you've unwound it needs a good supply of vitamin B12. And of course, just to keep the right parts of it coiled and uncoiled there. Quick look at pernicious anemia, the name for the complex set of symptoms that's caused by vitamin B12 deficiency. We talked about the megaloblastic anemia here, where we can't make enough blood cells of the right shape and size. We talked about the loss of energy, tissues. They often get a red tongue with cracks and stuff if it goes along. And because of the effect on the myelination process, we're going to see the various cognitive effects of it there. Just a quick look at some of these symptoms. You'll notice they're fairly often vague, generalized symptoms that could be attributed to a lot of different things. And not everybody gets every symptom. You might get 2 or 3 symptoms there, a couple here, and it wouldn't be till extremely late stages that you would be reading most of those. Brain fog, fatigue, memory loss, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, depression, paranoia, irritability, dizziness, numbness and tingling of the hands and feet, difficulty balance, decreased motor skills, gait disturbances, that sore burning red tongue, eye twitches, muscle spasms, muscle weakness, vision problems, shortness of breath, irregular heartbeat, diarrhea. Those are the types of symptoms. They are often a very slow and gradual onset and not frequently noticed. You're attributing them, well, we're just getting older. Yeah, I'm just more tired. It's part of my aging, and don't really attribute it to that. Often they're diagnosed as some psychiatric disorder, the fatigue, memory loss, anxiety, depression, paranoia. There can be aggressiveness, hallucinations. There can be, and they'll prescribe various psychiatric drugs without finding out what it is there. 2 groups of vegans that are at particular risk: long-term vegetarians who avoid supplements. There's a lot of alternative ideas about that. The bottom line is they don't pan out very well. Breastfed infants of vegan mothers who have a low B12 intake. The developing human brain is very, very dependent upon vitamin B12. If you can think of all the cell division that has to go on in a growing, developing brain, as well as every other organ of the body, the absolute essentialness of B12 in the breast milk from the mother having adequate B12 is absolutely essential there. Medical literature, unfortunately, is full of case studies of vegans of all ages, infants, children, adults, and elderly, who have sustained serious bodily damage from B12 deficiencies. It's not something we can ignore. It's something that we want to be aware of, plan ahead, and be able to prevent. And like I mentioned, we want to prevent it because many of the effects, particularly the cognitive, the brain changes, appear to be permanent. In other words, coming back and giving B12 after the fact might stop it from getting worse, but won't undo the damage that was done. Many long-term vegans who do not supplement appear to suffer no ill effects, may actually have an elevated homocysteine level or some very subtle neurologic dysfunction that they're not aware of. These are very slow, gradual. Remember, the liver is storing maybe up to 5 years of vitamin B12 there. And as that gradually depletes over time, there can be very mild, gradual symptoms right there. We don't have to live in confusion about that, though. Blood tests can give us a very clear picture of where you're at with your B12. If you're taking notes, this is the 1 second page I would take notes on here. These are what I would call the comfortable levels. These are levels, if you do and vitamin B12 level is readily done. Any doctor can do it. They run it in all the labs. Your doctor should be checking it if she knows you're a vegetarian. It should be greater than 500. A B12 greater than 500 is good. Homocysteine. Most doctors are now including homocysteine levels when they do a complete physical and workup there. It's one of the major risk factors for heart disease, the #1 cause of death. Your homocysteine level should be less than 10. If it's more than 10, I would be concerned that B12 may be the issue. The MMA, that toxic product we mentioned, can be tested, but is much less frequently done so. The MCV, the mean corpuscular volume, the size of your red blood cells, is part of every CBC, the complete blood count where you get hemoglobin, hematocrit, the various white cell counts. It'll have an MCV as one of the values on there. It should be less than 98. Remember the pictures of the enlarged red blood cells? If that mean corpuscular volume, the average size of those cells is getting too big, if it's 100, 105, 108, 110, you know, there's something wrong going on, and it very well could be this megaloblastic anemia from a B12. So between your CBC, a homocysteine level, and a B12 level, you can look at if your levels are in those, you're safe, you've got good, you're covered, everything's okay. If some of those are off, we need to be looking at what's the cause, what's the problem. Supplementation, I want to just very briefly look at intrinsic factor deficiency. There are situations where even if you take all of the right amount of B12 in your diet, you could still be deficient if your stomach was not making intrinsic factor. And there are some things we can do that can cause that. Today we have a huge amount of stomach acid blocking drugs, the hydrogen blockers and the proton pump inhibitors. The H blockers, the histamine blockers. Tagamet, Pepcid, Zantac, Prilosec, Protonix, Nexium, you may recognize some of those. Those, they shut down the production of acid. They also shut down the production of intrinsic factor. Gastric bypass surgeries of various types can remove much of the stomach, bypass much of the stomach, and again, cut out the vitamin B12. By the way, if you have one of these intrinsic factor deficiencies, what can we do about it? Well, it's very simple. You can get a B12 shot. And doctors for years may have been realizing that many older people need B12 shots. Sometimes just with age-related atrophy, the lining of the stomach is not producing intrinsic factor like it should, and you get a B12 shot. Now we've bypassed all of this absorption mechanism. It's absorbed directly. It's already in the body, and it can go out into the bloodstream and be transported to the cells that need it. So we can bypass the intrinsic factor deficiencies. Metformin, diabetics, this is one of the common drugs. Metformin can lead to an intrinsic factor deficiency. There are some genetic deficiencies that genetic mutations that can lead to deficiencies in it. Some dietary sources. Clams, 84 micrograms. Why would clams be such an excellent source of vitamin B12? What do clams eat? They sit on the bottom and they strain out the various fecal material that settles to the bottom of the bay, and so you would expect that they would be full of B12. Liver is a very high source, again, because the liver stores vitamin B12, so we can expect that. Today, they are now putting some B12 in certain cereals to make, as they put in all the various vitamins, they will add some vitamin B12 to cereals. Here we see some fish on there, has some cheeseburger. For all of that beef and the cheese in the cheeseburger, we get 2 micrograms out of it. Milk, 1 microgram. Egg, 0.6 micrograms in an egg. I know a lot of people say, well, I'm eating eggs, therefore I've got a good source of vitamin B12. Eggs are actually a very poor source of vitamin B12. If you're counting on eggs to get your vitamin B12, you really need to have those blood tests done because you could easily be moving into that deficiency range. Even chickens are a poor source of B12. Some people, they say, well, I have a lot of the different fermented foods, tempeh, natto, the miso, all these different fermented foods. They've got bacteria, they've got B12 in them. And what we find when we actually study them out, we find that they're actually probably very poor sources of B12. And you really can't count on them to supply the B12. You're going to need to actually take the B12 supplements, and if you have an intrinsic factor issue, take the B12 shots. That's really the only way. One interesting aspect is that of spirulina, blue-green algae. It's often recommended as a dietary supplement, and it has vitamin B12 in it, but of the B12 that's in it, only about 15% here is actually true vitamin B12 that we can use. The rest of it is actually a pseudo vitamin B12. And as this tail comes around here, you'll notice the molecule is just a little bit different. So when the mechanic picks up the tool and goes to use it, what does he find out? Well, he's got this tool and it feels right and he holds on to it, but it doesn't do the job because this is different. It can't release the piece up here that it needs to, and so as a result, it doesn't work. So we're basically block up all these mechanics are sitting around holding pseudo B12, and they're not working, they're not doing their job. So I would not include any of these blue-green algae supplements as an adjunct to your diet because of the pseudo B12 content you're going to find in them. So a warning there. So now we come full circle here to our conclusion. As we think about everything that God has done for us and created to study our nutrition, and throughout the course of history on this earth, particularly after the flood, introduction of the clean animals as a source of food that was recommended and has been used. And, why didn't Jesus promote a vegetarian diet when he was there if a vegetarian diet was so much better? We can, with this particular piece, see a little bit of insight into maybe one of the reasons why meat eating has been part of the human diet for most of our time here, particularly since the flood right here. We have needed to have vitamin B12, and there's really not a good source elsewhere to get it. If we don't supplement, we're not going to have it on a plant-based diet. But today, at this last sliver of Earth's history right now, science, the light has come in science, and now vitamin B12 is readily available here. It's readily available in such a form that anyone can get it. It's very inexpensive, and would highly, highly recommend it for all of us. And so we come to where we started right here, taking the methylcobalamin supplements, several times a week. It'll probably be adequate. I just take one every day. That way you don't forget them. They're easy to take. They're very inexpensive. And regardless of what's happening, you're always putting in that continuous supply of B12, building up the supply in your liver, and continuing to make that available on a regular basis for all of these processes. And I'd like to emphasize the fact that the damage from the deficiencies, particularly the neurological damage, does not seem to be reversible with resupplementation once the damage has occurred. And the fact that it is such a subtle and very, how shall I say, a difficult to notice and easily to give another explanation to. It's easy to explain that this could be due to, aging. It could be due to some chronic fatigue. There's a lot of things that you could blame it on and attribute it to and not notice it and just let it go. I've read many stories. One was the individual who was actually the owner of a health food store, and he lived a healthy plant-based diet and stuff, and he gradually deteriorated, was becoming dementia set in, and he got to the point where he couldn't function and stuff. Really very sad case. And at some point there, far along in that, they did a workup and found he was extremely vitamin B12 deficient. And we realized at that point that all of his symptoms were due to the vitamin B12 deficiency. But it was too late to recover the damage. It was too late to turn it around. It was too late to bring back the mind that had been lost, the cognitive functioning that had been lost. There are a lot of factors that contribute to Alzheimer's and the various dementias and various breakdowns, and I don't want to include that everything is a B12 deficiency, but the B12 deficiency is a very avoidable one and a very high-risk one for all of us who are on a plant-based diet. And so how do you know for sure? What did we say? The blood test, yeah. Your doctor can run the test, just remind him, say, hey, I'm on a plant-based diet. I want to be sure I'm not B12 deficiency. And what are the tests he needs to do? A B12 level, you want it greater than 500. Your regular CBC, they're going to run that all the time. Your MCV, your mean corpuscular volume, you want it less than 98. If it's over 100, there's a problem. It's probably easier to remember the 100. If it's over 100, you're in trouble. And then the homocysteine level. You want your homocysteine level less than 10. Those are going to be the factors that are going to allow you to know if you've got a problem or if you don't. And then, of course, if you've got a problem, there's the supplementation, or they can test for the intrinsic factor to see it's being absorbed, and the doctor may well want to put you on vitamin B12 shots. So that's our wisdom for this particular part of the program. May God bless you all as you continue your service for Him.